The Art Spy. Paris, August 19 to 20, 1944. A torrential storm was pummeling Paris, turning the skies forebodingly dark over a city in the midst of a tense mandatory blackout. The clamor of thunder and the sounds of war rose to a crescendo as the battle for Paris began. After 4 brutal years of German occupation, the City of Light was allegedly going to be liberated. Cannons boomed and shells whistled above the Seine just meters away from the Jeu de Paume Museum. Inside that 19th century building, 45-year-old French art historian Rose Valland peered out from a slightly open window. From the Jeu de Paume, Rose could see dark smoke rising from the Grand Palais, the glorious palace of iron, steel, and glass on the Champs-Élysées that was used throughout the occupation for propaganda exhibitions. The Germans had sent a remote-controlled tank barreling into the building to kill the French resistance fighters who had barricaded themselves inside. At just under 5.5 feet tall, Rose was dwarfed by the scale of the Jeu de Paume's colossal arched windows, but there was nothing timid about her. 4 years earlier, the Nazis had seized the museum to make it a headquarters for its art-looting force, to process the Jewish-owned art they had begun to plunder en masse in France. Her boss, Jacques Jaujard, the director of the Musées Nationaux, the French National Museums, immediately ordered her to, quote, remain at all costs at the Jeu de Paume Museum, end quote, and covertly spy on the Germans. Iron-willed Rose was determined to see her orders through, but she did not know that she would risk her life for the next 4 years to achieve her mission.
Hi, and welcome back to the Hyperallergic Podcast. When they were in power, the Nazis looted hundreds of thousands of artworks. They stole from state museums as well as private collections, particularly those of Jewish art collectors, both to hide from view modern works they saw as degenerate and to bolster the image of Nazi museums, but of course, also to make money. One of the places they stored a lot of their stolen art was at the Jeu de Paume. When they took control of the museum, they didn't think much of the curator in charge. The quiet and unassuming Rose Valland didn't tell them that she also understood German, and she quickly figured out their plans for the art. No one suspected that she was secretly recording all the details of the looting and keeping meticulous notes on exactly where each piece was being taken. When the war was over, she passed this information along to the famed monuments men. Those are the guys who worked to track down the treasures that the Nazis stole. In the process, she saved works by every major modern artist, from Cézanne to Picasso. And after the war, she published a popular book, and part of her story was even made into a Hollywood film. But there's still so much the world doesn't know about this remarkable woman. So today, we're talking to Michelle Young about her new book, The Art Spy, where she uncovered a whole new fascinating side of the curator and French resistance spy. From the parts of her life that she kept quiet, including her own identity as a queer woman, to the museum leaders that chose to collaborate with the Nazis. I'm Harag Vartanyan, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. Let's get started. So today we have Michelle Young to talk about her new book, The Art Spy. Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
So this is very exciting. You've been working on this for a while, and it seems to be a labor of love. Would you characterize it that way?
Yeah, it's been about 4 years now.
So Rose Valland, that's the person at the core of this book. And, you know, it's amazing how many people don't really know who she is.
Yeah, that's what got me started, really.
I know, but it's an incredible story. I mean, here's this like lesbian art historian curator working at a museum in Paris at the beginning of World War II. Why don't you introduce her a little bit to us? Because Rose is quite a character.
Yeah, so you got her started, but Rose Valland is an art historian spy who basically helps take down Hermann Göring and his art looting ring during World War II and continues to fight for justice after the war. But my book focuses on her wartime darings.
I mean, it's pretty an incredible story. I mean, I don't know what to say. But before we get into more details, let's talk about you a little bit.
All right.
I would love to hear the Michelle story. How did you get involved in art? Where did you grow up?
I grew up on Long Island. I'm from a town called Setauket. It is where America's first spy ring actually started.
No way.
George Washington
No way.
Created a spy ring based on members all from that town. So maybe that's where my obsession with spies comes from. My parents are from Taiwan, and they've always been very interested in art and culture. So growing up, I would be dragged to museums in whatever city we were visiting, probably starting at 8 a.m.
Right.
And I studied art history in college. I originally thought I was going to be an iBanker. That did not really pan out well. So I switched careers, majors a year in at Harvard, and studied art history. Then got a little derailed and went to work in the fashion industry as a merchandiser for several years, and then kind of freaked out and in my mid-20s and looked around my apartment, and it was full of books about art and architecture, and I kind of remembered again.
Couldn't get it up.
Yeah,
right?
I remembered again what it was that I loved. So
what, iBanking didn't suck that interest out of you? No?
I actually never even got started iBanking, so that's good news.
That is good news. Good news for the art world and the literary world too. So then, how would you describe your journey to make this book?
So for many years, I was running a company called Untapped New York, which still exists.
Absolutely, and
Secrets.
it's fantastic. Everyone should check it out.
And part of what we do are these experiences and tours. And we used to host drinks after certain tours. And I met a narrative nonfiction writer named Lori Gwen Shapiro. And I think from that moment, she said, "You should write a book." And I said, "I don't really have a story, so I'll let you know. You'll be the first to know."
Right.
And over the years, I sent her some ideas. She usually told me they were terrible. And one spring, I sent her this idea because I had discovered her in a book that I had been reading called Goring's Man in Paris by Jonathan Petropoulos. And she said, "This is the story." And she really helped me actually sell this book and prepare to write it.
That's amazing. So tell me a little bit about Untapped New York a little bit, because I mean, that's how I first got to know you.
Yeah, I know. Our publications are roughly the same age.
They
as
are,
well.
which is kind of surreal, right?
And not many of them that were created around that time are left. So
No,
we're
so
still
few.
here.
Why did you start Untapped?
I quit fashion.
Yep.
And I started wandering
Hallelujah.
around New York, almost like a tourist. So I felt like I knew New York, but turns out I didn't. And
Right.
when I put a new way of looking at the city that I lived in, there was so much to discover. And so that was the real origin behind it. It was not to have a company or to make money.
Right.
It was just, let's discover, let's share this information with the world. These days, we're mostly an experience company, but we keep the editorial around because it's my first love.
Of
So
course.
we're still sharing about New York City secrets.
So now, what do you feel like you learned from Untapped that you're bringing forward? What were some of those key lessons?
Well, I think when I research, whether it's for an article that I'm writing for Hyperallergic, Untapped New York, whatever,
Right.
or the book, it's what's that source that no one has looked at either ever or in a long time. So in the early days, I would always check Google Books.
Right.
Because there'd be some obscure journal with some fact that transformed your story. You entered with that piece of information instead of what everyone else is saying. And of course, in recent years, everything's become a PR machine. So basically,
Yes.
you're fed the information and you're expected to write a very standard story. But like, how do you enter a topic through a different way?
Absolutely. Which I guess comes to this. So how did you enter this topic in a different way?
So I wanted to look just at 5 years of her life.
Yeah.
That was important to me.
Yes.
It's not a biography. It's an action-oriented but true story of this woman. And I felt like she had not gotten her due. Her story is actually, I think, extremely exciting.
Yep.
But she's always positioned as, here's this mousy art historian who
Right.
worked in this museum. No. She's someone who worked on the nose of the Nazis for 4 years, every day, survived, lived to tell the tale, and has really dramatic stories within that. So I felt that my job as her newest biographer is to make her life exciting. Rose had a reputation for being overly serious and too blunt for her own good. But her unflappability had proven useful in the war. She had learned to play the role of a nobody to the Nazis, not important enough to notice, not congenial enough to be flirted with, and too grave to be easily friends with. Unlike the other women who worked in the French museums, she didn't bother much with her looks. Her most defining accessory was her round spectacles, which gave her an air of erudition. Although it was in vogue to wear one's tresses in soft waves just above the shoulder, Rose simply brushed her brunette locks to the side and pulled them back in a neat bun. She left her eyebrows natural and mildly unkempt, unlike those popularized by cinema stars like Arletty and Danielle Darrieux, who wore them razor thin and drawn in darkly with pencil. Sartorially, Rose did her best to fit in. Though she would have much preferred to wear pants, she donned feminine ankle-length dresses and blended in with the rest of the women in Paris, modest, traditional, and discreet. Still, the Germans had accused Rose of everything in their arsenal: sabotage, theft, and signaling to the enemy. They subjected her to invasive interrogations and searches, and even expelled her from the museum on several occasions. But she talked her way back in every time, explaining calmly that she was just a lowly employee of the French National Museums who oversaw the building's maintenance and the remaining art collection. In reality, she was one of the most well-educated art historians in France, and nearly every one of the German accusations had been true.
First of all, I just want to say how well written the book is.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I just think it's really a page turner, and I will say, as I told you before, but I'll tell everyone else, I loved it so much that I was like, no, I'm keeping this for my vacation in June. So I didn't finish it on purpose. I was like, I want to be able to enjoy this, because it's sort of like it goes into these deep histories, of all these different people. So we're talking 1939 to 44.
Yep.
And that's this very small period, which, I have to say, when you first told me about the book, I was like, but there's been so much written about those 4 or 5 years, right? Like, how are you going to say something new? But you're able to do it. So how did you do that?
I think I thought of it as almost like a movie. And I thought of it also as the reader. I didn't really write it from being a writer perspective, right? And so one of the things I did was actually I wrote this book with no outline, no chapter thing. And at the end of every section or every chapter, I would think, where should it go next? As the reader, who do I feel like I need to visit again?
Yeah.
And I think that was really like the framework of how I put together this thing. And then I also discovered the story as I went along, like a reader discovers it.
Right.
And hopefully, I think that's a kind of unique way to write such like a large book.
Yeah.
And that really comes from my architecture background, which really taught me you've got to just iterate, fail, try again, and then something is created out of this process.
Absolutely.
But I think also to your question, there is the idea of looking at the war from the art perspective. That I think is not fully tapped at all. And there are many ways to talk about it. And here we talk about not just the looting of art by the Nazis, but how did these countries and museums protect for war? And then how do they survive under the occupation?
Yeah, and there were so many lovely moments, including like when you're like, well, the Nazis accused her of being a spy and this and that, and you're like, mostly true, but which I love, because I mean the fact that she was able to do all this is actually pretty incredible.
Right. And I read a lot of stories about women spies. That's like my favorite subgenre of book, basically. No exaggeration. And every time I read them, I think, what would I have done? Could I have survived this? The answer is no. And especially with her, it's the daily stress that must have been to keep that poker face, to pretend she was not doing what she actually was doing. That question ran through my head the whole time.
And the other thing I was really intrigued by, and I guess I wasn't expecting this part of the story, but how much institutionally as a woman, like going through French civil service, like the barriers, the relationships, all those types of things. Like I loved reading that because it's so lost to us in a contemporary moment.
Yeah.
What did it tell you about being a woman in 1920s, 30s, 40s France?
I mean, it was almost like them working was a curiosity.
Right?
Yeah. And therefore, they were almost never paid.
Right.
And they assumed you had some man to support you. And so one of the only other, maybe the only other female curator, she was the wife of a famous sculptor, Georges Saupique. So she didn't need to be paid because here's Georges Saupique. So women had a really hard time, and especially someone like Rose, who didn't come from Paris, didn't come from a wealthy or this institutionalized, successful family, and trying to make her way.
So what did you learn about Rose? Like, what was it for you? Like, first of all, what was it about her personality? I mean, other than being a spy, clearly that's your soft spot.
Yeah.
That may have spoken to you. And what was it about her? Like, because, when you take on a project like this, you're kind of having a conversation with with
Yeah.
the deceased.
Yeah, I think it was two things. One, her persistence really felt something that I identified with in terms of writing this book. Getting the information that I needed to tell any particular scene was like a vast project in itself.
Right.
And I'm someone that like kind of never gives up until I've exhausted all the avenues of possibilities. And even if I don't find it at that time, it's in the back of my mind. And so there were things that I tabled thinking hopefully I'll come across it in some random way. So
I love that.
That was a big one. I think this idea that as a woman, as a lesbian, she was constantly being underestimated. And I feel like in the early parts of my career,
As a working class person too, like background, absolutely.
So as a person of color in America, and especially as like a petite Asian female, you get a label put on you.
Right.
And I had to find my own way to work my career because of that. I worked in the corporate world before, but everyone just assumes things.
Right.
And so I realized early on in my mid-20s, I got to start my own thing. And through that, then my career can grow.
Yeah. So now, what was the craziest fact you discovered about Rose? If you want to share that for people to whet their appetites.
One of the things that I worked a long time on was she had witnessed this burning of 500 paintings, modern paintings, Picasso, Leger, these type of painters, things worth millions and millions today. She claimed that she had seen it, the Nazis burned them in the garden of her museum in the summer of 1943. And it was something that had been questioned immediately after she wrote this in her book, but I traced it back, and it was the Nazis in the museum who made a statement that said, it didn't happen, and if it did, Rose was involved, right?
Wow.
But once something is questioned, it starts to enter the public record, and it gets repeated and repeated. So with myths like that, you have to start digging into the root of it and then try to find the evidence around it. Yeah. So I'm excited to say that I'm able to prove incontrovertibly that this event happened and that she was correct. Yeah.
Hundreds of paintings.
Yeah, she says about 500 modern paintings were burned.
Unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
But it's so interesting because and I think that's one of the things about this book that I think is important, and that's why I really want people to look at it, is because you can see contemporary parallels.
Yes.
Right. And I think in that case, that's like very fake news, right? Like as soon as someone makes an accusation, you accuse the opposite. You know, and it's just, and we can all interpret that the way we want to, but like that's pretty shocking, right?
Yeah.
And then the other part is when the ideology of the Nazis were sort of being disseminated to museums, how many museum directors just complied?
Yes.
And tried to get their jobs back.
That example of one of the most important art historians and curators in Germany at the Geheime...
The picture gallery,
The picture gallery,
right.
Yes, exactly. And he immediately...
My German's not that good to say the actual German.
But he immediately capitulated and even tried to
minimize,
fudge his records a bit to say,
I only bought a
public
few.
We bought it with public funds, so it wasn't me. But yes, you used the public funds.
Right. And most of them were donated. I think that was part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Most of them were donated.
And he managed to survive all the way to the extent of becoming Hitler's curator for the Führer Museum, his pinnacle art project.
Right? Which just shows how those who comply kind of fudge the system. It's
So there were echoes throughout, and when I was really deeply embedded, I was basically living in 1930s, 1940s Nazi Europe, and I would see and hear similar phrases being thrown around here and then read it in my paper. So that was kind of harrowing.
Yeah, I bet. So how was that experience? Because, I've heard from historians, especially of genocide, where they say they end up having slight PTSD symptoms, or they have these nightmares of research material. Did any of that happen to you? Did any of this material? Because this is pretty harrowing material.
Yeah. I don't think I had nightmares, but early on I was reading Mein Kampf in the middle of the night, and that was really creepy. I had a newborn, I was pumping, and then I was reading Mein Kampf.
I mean, I'm sure you creeped yourself out sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Where you're like, oh, and here we are again.
Yeah. Yes.
Were there any real challenges or obstacles in the research you were doing?
Yeah, Rose was not someone that shared a lot of information, definitely almost never any emotions. And even in her memoir, some of the most exciting chapters she actually cut out, or the editor cut out. So there's a chapter about her escape from Paris with all the museum guards on a on a flat bottom boat through the Seine. So exciting. And I managed to find the chapter that was cut in an archive.
Amazing. Was it really juicy?
Yes. And I had to scour her like hand scribbled notes within the documents in the archives to try to find and figure out what her true personality is, not the one that she presented out in the world in her like very academic book about the war.
I love that. So this is a galley, but I'm assuming it's very similar with the chapter and the dates.
Exactly.
So people can kind of get a sense. And I did love the way the photos were interspersed.
Yeah,
you know?
that's a new way. I feel like in books, it used to be a center section, but now you see things as you're reading them, which is nice.
Absolutely. And I feel like it really captures a little bit of that energy, like that image of
the raft of the Medusa
being pulled out of the museum like that.
It's actually, yeah. So that's part of the story about Rose helping to protect the art in the French museums during this time. And there were some paintings that were so big, they had to get a theatrical trailer. And this was one of them to move it.
It just kills me that it's like, it's uncovered.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
You know, the way it's sort of being moved, it looks fully uncovered.
A lot of the art was stored this way, actually.
Isn't that crazy to me?
Yeah.
I mean, it just like you're driving through the streets of Paris with an uncovered raft of the Medusa. Okay.
Yeah, and actually it has a dramatic incident where probably it should have been covered.
Really?
Yeah, it almost it hits the truck hits some electrical wires.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
There we are. See, that's always a little bit of drama in the art world. God.
Yeah.
So now, what did you understand about Rose in general? Like, because she seemed like a very private person.
Yeah.
Which I assume most queer people in that era would have had to been. You mentioned about the dangers of that.
Yeah.
But, you know, more than that, like to deal with that kind of daily, frankly, humiliation of being sort of like, you know, being looked over. I mean, you talk about how Verne, the guy at the Louvre, who is like constantly like writing critical letters, do you know, be like, well, we can get someone maybe better qualified.
And you're like, she basically had like 5 graduate degrees.
Right? Exactly. And you even say that, like she was actually probably better educated in the field than he was.
She was for sure.
And then she like sits there and she's like, you know, she's doing the daily work of being at the museum to safeguard this art.
Yeah.
Why did she feel the need to protect this stuff with that kind of vigilance?
Right. So she comes from a working class family. Her father's a blacksmith, and she discovers art at some point in her younger years. And for the rest of her life, she's driven by this idea that there is this idea of beauty in the world that must be saved.
Right.
And I thought about that a lot in terms of we need to instill in the next generation a drive for something greater than their day-to-day, whether it's just like stuck on Instagram or whatever. But I think now more important than ever, we have to be driven by something bigger. And that was really important for me to explain. And I think that's why we need to celebrate someone like her.
Right.
Because it was not about money. It was not about fame. It's something unquantifiable.
But also communal.
Yeah, right.
Like it wasn't just about her.
No.
At all.
Yeah, about society.
Society, right. She felt this sort of like need to preserve this thing for everyone.
Yes.
Do you know?
Yes.
And it feels really like like you can get that sense.
Okay, yeah.
There's something special there.
Right.
And that's the part that like I kept going like, I wonder what the deal was here. And now you're telling me that even like her biography was censored in a way or like omitted certain things. Why do you think that was?
She was very focused after the war to try to lay out why and how the Nazis looted art. And so it became less of here's my memoir and more almost like a thesis.
Right.
And so in that light, her chapter about escape, not really relevant. All the exciting points got like kind of like minimized.
So it became less about her and more about this thing.
And that's a testament to her. She like did not want this to ever happen again.
Right.
But I think for her own posterity, that's how she got shortchanged. And you know, actually, after her book was published in the early 60s, Hollywood did option a chapter of her book and made it into the Burt Lancaster movie called The Train. And so she was well known and she did have fame at that time, but I think the long-term longevity of her book, it wasn't there. And the French government, she claims that they actually censored it after.
Oh, really?
And people prevented her from writing a sequel.
Why?
Her work started to get a little too close to the powers that be.
Yikes.
There were people like Henri Verne, for example, who served as middlemen to the Nazis. This is something I actually discovered in the U.S. archives. Wow. The French don't have a record of this, but
You're kidding.
yeah, the U.S. documents had like a list of Nazi middlemen, and there he was suddenly, and I was like, I knew he was a bastard based on like the stuff he wrote about her, but this kind of when I
Were
found
there a lot of art people that were like intermediaries?
Yes,
there were.
Yes, it was just very opportunistic at that time. There were a few people like Rose who were like so by the book and knew what the priorities were, and were looking to a day in which the Nazis would lose the war.
Right.
She was thinking, we're going to use this evidence that I'm gathering in war tribunals and to get the art back. So she was thinking far ahead and believing in mankind, basically.
I mean, that's pretty incredible that she had the foresight to do that. That's pretty incredible. So now let's talk about, I mean, I can't ask you as Untapped New York, founder, like not to ask about the New York part of this story.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about those New York aspects?
Yeah. So I actually have two storylines in this book. There's Rose's storyline, which is obviously the main one, but I wanted to tell the story of art looting in a way that the reader can grasp. It's not just X collection and Y collection, and these are all looted, and so much work is looted. I follow the story of one family, and it's the Rosenberg family. Paul Rosenberg, the patriarch, is the exclusive art dealer to Picasso, Matisse, Leger, and Braque.
So an important person, yeah.
Exactly. And their story is amazing. Part of the family makes it to New York, escaping through their own harrowing journey. And the son, Alexander Rosenberg, ends up fighting for Charles de Gaulle as part of the Free French. And miraculously, his story and Rose's story intersect in the last section of the book, which is another reason to bring their storyline in. So in terms of New York, Paul Rosenberg ends up opening a gallery on 57th Street, down the street from Knoedler, and all those other art galleries.
Yep. In the gallery district of the time.
Yeah, and they're heavily involved in the Free France movement here in New York. They meet Charles de Gaulle when he comes here. But there's also one of Rose's main supporters, advocates. His name is James Roemer, and he's the director of the Met Museum. And he also actually was the person who made the cloisters come to life.
That's great. And then also you talk about her relationship with MoMA and working with Alfred Barr and like sort of these different putting in exhibitions during the early years at the Jeu de Paume.
Yeah.
Do you know? So it's like, that was actually really interesting. I guess I didn't really know that part.
Yeah. And that was actually something I discovered too, because what had been said before was that she was working as maybe like they say unofficial curator at the Jeu de Paume, but what was her role exactly? And by going through all the papers, you realize that she was writing letters directly to Barr. She was really almost running the show because her boss, André Deserrois, he was traveling all around the world. I saw a quote somewhere saying, like, befitting of his social class at station, his job was not to do the itty-bitty work of the museum, but was to go and hobnob, acquire new works, plan new exhibitions. And then it was Rose's job to make those exhibitions come to life. So she's working.
But she was only called a secretary.
Yeah, for the first at least 4 years, she was an unpaid secretary, and then she becomes an unpaid kind of entry-level curator.
So you mentioned that she like supported herself teaching classes and teaching English.
She was what I would call in modern day words hustling. So,
right, she really was. Like I was like, has this not ended? Because I felt like how familiar that is now, right?
Yeah.
How many art people I know who have like these sort of passion projects. Which, I mean, in this case, the Jeu de Paume shouldn't have been a passion project, but ended up becoming one. Though I guess if you're a curatorial assistant at MoMA, it's sort of the same thing with the amount they're paying nowadays.
Yeah, so she's teaching art. She is giving tours of not just her museum, but other museums. She's teaching French. Oh, she's also selling art. I found all these documents about her, like basically acting as an art broker.
What was she selling? You mentioned there was like a couple of paintings she sold to, who was it? Who was it?
She sold one to the Guggenheim.
That was it. That was the one.
So there was like a Juan Gris painting. There's another one that's in, there's a Leger. And there's another painting that's in the Cleveland Museum of Art. And she's listed in the provenance of these paintings, which is amazing.
That is amazing. I mean, she was everywhere.
Yeah.
So how do you think she got through it? You know, like because she doesn't come from means. That must have been a struggle, a daily struggle for her. You know, and her partner and her, they lived together in Paris, which of course, as you mentioned, in the 20s would have been like sort of like the hotbed of lesbian sort of communities, you know, but at the same time, like it must have been hard.
Yeah, she really learned to subsume her emotions. And I think she had done this at an early age. She was in the closet as a lesbian. She was an outsider in all the schools she ended up going. And the thing that really struck me was there was an interview in Elle magazine, probably around the time the movie The Train came out. And at the end, she's back in the museum. They've turned it into the set for the movies. And there's Nazis running around in their boots with their rifles. And she actually has a moment where she loses her composure and cries.
I bet.
And she runs out of the museum. And then I think it's the next day or whenever they interview her again, she's like, I don't know what happened. But basically, like all the years, even after the war, that she never addressed any of this stuff, it actually came to the surface suddenly when she was back in that environment.
Unbelievable.
But I think when you have a history of learning how to hide who your true self is, that's what made her a good spy. She just had to continue doing it in a slightly different way, but
she knew her code switching.
yeah. Yeah.
she knew it well, right?
Yeah.
She really did. So now, what do you think people are going to be most surprised about in this story? I mean, we've heard stories of the resistance. We've heard stories about, the different people who've saved art, through the years, the George Clooney film and all that.
Yeah.
all these kinds of things. For me, I love hearing just about her story of like this kind of like working class woman who sort of moved to Paris and tried to make it. But as you even mentioned, with all her education, she never quite had that ease in elite society.
Yeah.
Right. There was always something. How about some of the people that knew her that you interviewed, or her family and these types of things? Like, tell us a little bit about what like they knew about her.
Overall, everyone said that she was a very tough person. Oh. And there were people that ended up working on the Rose Valland Association in France, but they actually didn't even like her. They just felt...
Wait, what?
There's a woman, she lived in her hometown, was married to a famous actor in France, and she was passionate about this organization that they had created in the town to have her memory, and to...
Right.
I was supposed to interview her, and she unfortunately died around the time that I was supposed to interview her. But from what I heard, she didn't like her as a person. But I think it's such a testament to Rose and what she did that even if you didn't like her, you believed that what she did was important. And you wanted to help her fight for that and for posterity to know.
Right.
And future generations to know. I think maybe the most surprising thing for most people is how extensive the protection of art was in France. Like, this wasn't just like packing up some artwork. They planned for 8 years, I think, for a future war.
Right.
And it was a well-oiled machine by the time war broke out. So the amount of resources dedicated to making sure that the art was protected is huge. And I had written a story a few years ago about Ukraine and how it reacted to the Russian invasion, and they were not prepared in nearly the same way.
No. And you mentioned that it was partly because of World War I.
Yes.
Because they actually had that experience of like that it was only when the Germans crossed the border did they come up with a plan to save the art.
Right. And they were like, we can't ever have that happen ever again.
Right.
I think the other thing is a lot of people assume they moved the art because they thought the Nazis would steal it. They actually had very little conception that was going to happen. It was to protect it from bombings and military action.
Right.
And then later, it became also convenient that they had been moved out of Paris.
Right. You mentioned also like even the things they kept, they sort of filled the galleries with like sandbags and lock things and different.
Yeah, a lot of on-site protection because they couldn't move everything.
Right. Which told me it was about bombing really than just theft.
Yes. And they ended up moving, for example, the Victory of Samothrace, that massive, beautiful sculpture in the roof.
Ancient art, yeah.
At the last minute, because they actually thought that it would survive in the place that it was at, but they realized that the vaulting above would actually collapse. They did like a new engineering study, and they're like, oh no. So it got moved out the day that war broke out.
That's crazy.
I think the other surprising thing, which is just a short part of the book, but Rose's partner is actually arrested and interned by the Germans. And they were arresting everyone British because they were considered enemy aliens. The Germans thought they were.
Even though her dad was German.
Her dad was German. She had gone to school in Germany.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. Yeah. And this chapter, I feel like, this chapter of the war, I had not even heard of it.
Yeah.
And I read a lot of books about World War II. Yeah. And so I think it kind of has echoes to today because should we break out into war in America or any other Western country, who is going to be considered an enemy? An alien, right? We already have this term. And so it's like men, women, and children, elderly, who were incarcerated and thrown into prisons in France, and many, many died during the war.
It's shocking.
just for being British.
It's so shocking, isn't it? Wow. Ooh. All of it. It's so crazy to me. I just, it fascinates me that the preservation of art like this, like, what do you think we can learn from it? Can we learn from these stories? Like, what is it to preserve art? Like, what do you think that Rose can teach us through the years, about what the value of this is?
I think it's that we should not be complacent about any kind of status quo. Like, they were always rethinking, making new lists. What should be protected? How should we do it? They lived in a time in which war could break out at any time. And I feel like we've gotten into a place where we just assume nothing will happen. Like, everything will stay the same.
Yeah.
But that is a false sense of complacency. And also we need to think about climate change.
Yep.
And where are these museums located? I don't think that many museums have planned for natural disasters. The only thing that comes to the top of my head right now is when they built the new Whitney, they made that ground floor floodable in reaction to that. But that's kind of like a rare case out of
Right.
the many.
I do think that is that's starting to happen.
Yes.
Like, buildings in New York now often put their electrical
and
rooms like on third or fourth
Yeah.
floors. And these are in responses to Sandy
Right.
and all these different kinds of incidents. I totally get that. We just see it even in Sudan recently, where the museum was looted,
Yeah.
and it's just like, we may talk about the Louvre, but the reality is so many smaller museums are being impacted so severely.
Right. So it's like every museum needs a plan. Every
Yeah.
institution needs a plan, not just our largest ones.
So, did it make you love art more writing this book? Like, what is your relationship with art after writing this book?
What was interesting to me was that I thought when I started the book that I would write a lot more about all the individual paintings and stuff. But in the end, actually, it was about something bigger. And so I did talk about the paintings, and some of them get a little more airtime than the others. Like Vermeer's Astronomer was like #1 for the Nazis to get their hands on, and they did get it. It's card #1 in the Nazi files.
Did they explain why?
Well, predominantly it's because Hitler only wanted the old masters, so
Right.
that was sort of in the right
Of course,
vein.
yep.
But it was also from the Rothschild family. And this painting had been in their collection maybe hundreds of years.
I see.
And so it had never been
Symbolic.
kind of owned by anyone else.
So there's a symbolism there too.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, how about your writing? How did you feel like your writing changed, or was it a challenge to you to sort of change the writing, or like, how did you challenge yourself, literary wise?
So I think my experience writing online was really helpful, because I think when you write online, you need to hook the reader in very quickly. It's not
right.
like sitting in reading a magazine at home or something.
Yep.
If you lose them in the first paragraph, you've lost them.
That's right. They're not coming back.
So I knew how to already move between more academic writing and a more popular style. I thought of a lot of my early loves, which was fiction. I only became a nonfiction person in my mid-20s, 30s, thinking about the books that I loved and how things are described, and forgetting some of the nonfiction writing.
Right.
That I've been
That's
doing.
fair. I get that. So this is awesome. I mean, I think people should run out to read it.
Thank you.
I think it's really important. I also love that it just feels very accessible. You did your utmost to make it as accessible as possible. I didn't feel like, sometimes I'm reading these books and you're like, what is that? I'll have to go look it up. But I feel like you were very explanatory. It was very clear what was going on.
Right.
And if you had just like a basic knowledge of art, that's all you kind of needed,
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I didn't feel
Right.
like you needed to have this kind of in-depth knowledge of
No,
art
and
to
I
really enjoy it.
That was purposeful, because I think the morals and the takeaways from the book are more important than, being highfalutin about like art specifically. And in order to do that, I really thought about, does this word or this sentence really need to be on the page?
Right.
And if it doesn't, then it's gone.
That's right. Well, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. And people, I hope will run out and grab it. And it is quite a page turner and a great summer read. So thank you so much for putting this together and for breathing some life into Rose again so we can all learn about her example. And I think a lot of people who work in the art world will really appreciate the struggle she went to, because I think sometimes we have a tendency to maybe whitewash the past in terms with our imagination, where things were easier and maybe people got jobs easily or whatever. But she's a good example of actually it was always very tough for a lot of people in the art world, particularly when they don't adhere to a certain kind of elite lineage and family and all that. And she proves how the art world has always been a conglomeration of a lot of different people who just love art.
Yeah.
Including yourself.
Right, exactly.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. This episode was edited and produced by Isabella Segalovich. And this podcast is brought to you by the amazing Hyperallergic members. Thank you to all the members out there. For only $8 a month or $80 a year, you too can become a supporter of the best independent arts journalism out there. We tell the stories no one else is telling. Visit hyperallergic.com to learn more. I'm Hrag Vartanian, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. Thanks for listening. See you next time.